Welcome to today's professional development webinar on social network analysis. This webinar will provide an introduction to the network paradigm crucial to understanding economic development. It will introduce core concepts and instruments essential for network data scrutiny. The webinar will also offer some guidance on using R for conducting social network analysis. My name is Zsófi Zádor. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Northeastern University, London, at the Network Science Institute. In the next couple of minutes, I will introduce the Regional Studies Association, share some of the housekeeping rules, and finally, and most importantly, we'll move on to introduce today's speaker. So the Regional Studies Association is the global and interdisciplinary network for urban and regional research, development, and policy. The RSA supports its members with latest research, funding schemes, networking, and publishing opportunities, and spaces to grow research and careers. Today's seminar is one of the initiatives through which RSA supports its members. If you would like to know more about the webinar, funding, and publishing opportunities, please feel free to explore the RSA website on regionalstudies.org. A couple of words about housekeeping. As you might have gotten a message, this webinar is and will be recorded, and it will be made available on the RSA Lounge. If you have any questions, it can be also during the webinar and while Tom's speaking, please put them in the Q&A box. And if you are tweeting, please make sure to use the hashtag as RSA webinar to tweet about the event. Without further ado, I would like to introduce today's speaker, Broekel, who is a professor in regional innovation at the University of Stavanger Business School, Norway. He earned his master's and PhD in economics from Jena and has since held positions in Utrecht, Hanover, and Stavanger. Tom's research delves into the nexus of innovation and regional development, recently exploring the influence of regional news and narratives within this sphere. His methodological expertise is broad, encompassing advanced quantitative empirical methods, such as social network analysis, non-parametric efficiency estimations, regression analysis, and also text analysis, all aimed at enhancing the understanding of economic development and informing effective policy. Now I would like to give the floor to you, Tom. You have 20 minutes for your webinar, and then in the meanwhile, please put any questions in the Q&A box.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Sophia. Thanks a lot for giving me the opportunity here to give you an introduction into the social network analysis. This introduction will be extremely brief. We're talking 20 minutes of an entire methodology. So I will really try to give you a kind of flyover of different aspects that can be done with the social network analysis and what it's for. So this will be relatively quick, but I also think that we have some time afterwards to answer some questions. And of course, you can also approach me through other channels if you like, if you want to know more. So firstly, since a lot of you have signed up for this webinar, I assume that you are already quite interested in networks, or at least have a broad idea that networks are essentially all around us, right? We can characterize the entire economy as a kind of flow network where things move from one sector to another. We have trade networks. We have input-output networks, global supply chains, and things like that. We have mobility networks where people move from one point in place to another one. We can have even science as a kind of network presented when you have, for instance, individual journals or disciplines as nodes in these networks. And of course, you can also look at R&D subsidies or related type of joint projects that can be the cornerstone of some knowledge networks. So these are just random examples, more or less, of kind of networks that are all around us. And it's quite interesting that even though a lot of our economy and a lot of our society relies on these type of networks, if you look at standard classes at the university level and methodology classes, they rarely talk about networks. So therefore, this is meant to be a small introduction if you're interested in these type of things. So, but there's a little bit more. So social network analysis is not just, let's say, a kind of methodology that you can apply similarly to a regression analysis. From my perspective, I would actually argue that when you look at networks and look from a, let's say, network perspective, this really changes the way you view certain things. That is by acknowledging the presence of networks and really thinking in terms of the presence of networks, you actually consider more of the relational and systematic nature of most economic and social processes around us. And a key message there is that all the entities, be it actors, organizations, regions, you name it, all of them don't really act in isolation, but many of them actually react and act with other entities together. And this is really fascinating because just a small sidestep, if you think about the methodological toolbox that is presented in standard econ classes, let's say, one of the core assumptions there is usually that observations are independent, which is, of course, the opposite of what's happening in reality, where everything is linked to everything in a certain way. So by looking at networks and from a network perspective, you change a little bit the perspective of how you look at economic and other types of processes. And I would even say it also enriches the perspective because you consider also relations and networks between entities as, let's say, factors that may in themselves drive certain economic processes and outcomes, but also you can consider them as objects or subjects of your study. So there's a lot to this network perspective, but let's break it down and give you a brief introduction into some core aspects. I will first talk briefly about network data and then go through these other points step by step. So let's clarify a little bit terminology. So if you read in the literature, and in particular, if you look also into other disciplines that are concerned about networks like physics and sociology, they do use a different terminology, but actually mean the same thing. And if you work with some of the softwares, this may feel confusing in the beginning. Therefore, I really would like to clarify that. So frequently, networks are also referred to as graphs. Okay, that's something we simply have to accept. In our literature, I would say we use networks more or less as the key term. But if you go into physics and so on, you will see the notion of graphs popping up, which is just a synonym for networks. Also, we usually refer to nodes when we talk about networks. In other disciplines, let's say physics and sociology, vertices and actors are used as terms. Links are sometimes called edges and ties in sociology, edges in physics. And I just named this again. Some of these terms will reappear when you apply certain methods or when you work with some methods. If we talk about networks, there's all sorts of network data around that actually has quite different features. For instance, there are undirected networks, meaning the relationship of one node to another one has no direction. In contrast, there are directed networks. So it matters basically which nodes influence or has a relationship with the other one. This does not mean necessarily that the relationship is reciprocal. Right? So Bob can be a friend of Biff in this example, but Biff may not feel the same way, which is a sad situation for Bob, but it may be a very it's still relevant information. And if you consider, for instance, the flow of money, it very much matters whether Bob lends money to Biff or whether Biff lends money to Bob. So there's a first distinction one can make between undirected and directed network. Then we have something that is referred to as binary networks, which essentially just says these two nodes, they have a link, yes or no. In contrast, there are also valued networks where the relationship between two nodes may be of a different quality or quantity. There might be some frequency of interactions. For instance, if we talk about money being lent between or borrowed between persons, then for instance, the value of this relationship between two nodes or two persons that receive money from each other or that borrow money may be the amount of money that is borrowed. So all these different types of network data are basically out there, and they kind of require different methodologies, or at least to be aware that the underlying network is of one of these kinds. Good. Then the question is, where do we actually get network data from? So while we have some of the terminology correct, and I'll try to not ponder too much on that, the question is, where do we get network data from? Well, ideally, you connect network data through surveys, interviews, or you have some kind of documented interaction. This is known as direct observations of networks. So you see node A is interacting with node B, or person A has a relationship of this sort with person B. However, and we can talk about this in the Q&A later, more frequently we actually observe an indirect relationship between nodes or entities. This is usually when we talk about co-occurrence, and I think we're all familiar with something like this. For instance, if I co-author a paper together with somebody else, and you observe the paper and the co-authors being named on this paper as your empirical observation, this doesn't mean necessarily that I really have interacted with my co-author. Of course, we assume that, and in most cases, this will also be the case, but you don't really know. And still, you know, there's a relationship between these two co-authors, and this is called a two-mode network. I just name it here. And this type of data is quite frequently available. We use it a lot, for instance, with patents, with co-publications, joint projects, and so on and so forth. But it is not really directly observed network relation data, and yet it is quite common. And it's something we sometimes have to take care of and treat in a certain way. But for that, we would have to go a lot deeper than what I can do here in 20 minutes. So there was a brief overview of some issues related to network data, which nevertheless, I think, give a good idea what we're talking about empirically. Then the next thing you might wonder is, well, he presented all these nice visualizations in the beginning. Is there anything I need to know about visualizations or network visualizations to begin with? The first one is usually the type of network visualizations you observe in, let's say, academic papers, in newspapers, on websites, and wherever. Usually, if you just look at pure network data, the position of the nodes, so where these nodes are located, and the lengths of the links between them usually have no meaning. And this is really important to consider because it really changes potentially the interpretation of certain network plots. Look at these two pictures down there. On the left-hand side, the visualization was done with the so-called Fruchterman-Reingold mechanism. On the right-hand side with a circle of sphere mechanism. Doesn't really matter in this case with the precise mechanisms behind it, but just see how different the picture looks like and how much information you feel you can really extract from this. So visualizations of networks are usually done to optimize aesthetic appeal and to give some clarity to some structural characteristics you care about. Yeah, so you have to be careful there. Usually it's just visuals. You should not and cannot really interpret these type of visualizations unless you plot the networks onto some kind of other data. So in our context, usually we can plot, for instance, a network onto geographical coordinates, meaning we know where individual entities, actors, organizations are located in space, and we can connect, so to speak, their locations then if we observe a network relationship between the two. Of course, in this case, then the position of nodes has a meaning. It's essentially geography and their geographical position. And the length that is in the network, of course, also obtains some meaning. In this case, the distance between these two nodes. But this is, in our discipline, I would say probably the most frequently visualized network. But in other disciplines, this would be something totally different. And here, this type of underlying information is not available. If you talk about non-spatial entities, and then the visualizations don't really tell you that much. They're just for aesthetic appeal. Good. Flyover, network data, network visualizations, just some aspects I would like to highlight. Let's talk about some real properties of networks and how to quantify them using a method or methods from social network analysis. The first one is there are, when you talk about networks, 3 different levels you can look at. The first one is a node level. So you may ask a question about what are characteristics of individual nodes in these networks. Then you can, of course, also pay attention to the links and say, hey, I'm more interested in the links, so the relationships between these nodes. Or you can ask questions about the characteristics of the entire network as such. So if we look at the node level, the most prominent concept is that of centrality. Here you ask the question, what is the most central or most prominent node in a certain networks? And while this seems like an easy question, it is not easy to answer because there are a lot of different concepts. For instance, you have something called degree centrality, asking the question of how well is a node embedded into a network, and essentially it just counts the number of direct links or the number of other nodes this node is connected to. In contrast is closeness centrality. That is how far in terms of steps you have to go in the network is one node from another on average across the entire network. Or betweenness, which is also quite frequently used, that kind of asks the question, okay, if something is flowing in the network, which of these nodes is the one that is most likely to be able to control or shape these flows? And as you can see in this example network, all three types of network centrality measures would emphasize or would identify different nodes to be most central in the network. And there's more actually. So there's eigenvector centrality and some other centralities I don't even talk about. So you have a range of centrality measures at the node level that allow you to quantify the position or prominence of a node in a network. We use this, for instance, in a paper, shameless self-promotion, of course, in these type of webinars, where we ask the question, does being in a technology cluster in terms of an organization improves the access to information that is potentially flowing in inter-organizational knowledge networks? We use patent data, subsidized joint projects, and the measures of degree and betweenness centrality. So if you want to see these type of centrality measures in academic action, so to speak, this paper is one, but really just one example where this has been used. Let's move to the link level. The nice thing is the link level is on the one hand a visual thing, so you can look at this network and then identify links, for instance, that act as bridges. Meaning if you remove this link, a network will disintegrate into multiple parts. But, and this is a nice thing, you can also apply some of the node level centrality concepts, like for instance, betweenness centrality, to the link level and ask essentially, okay, which is the link that controls or is most important for the flows in the networks? And this one, in this case, would be H and I, where basically everything that flows from the left-hand side of the network to the right-hand side would have to go through this individual link. And you can calculate this. We used it in a paper, which I just refer here to, where we looked at whether there is still an effect of the Berlin Wall, which we can see in today's knowledge networks in Berlin, where we try to figure out, okay, is there still a wall effect? Do we see still up to today a division between the eastern part of Berlin, which belonged to the former communist part of Germany, and the western part that did not belong to that? And then we looked at link level characteristics of these networks. Again, using patent data, co-publication data, and some subsidized joint projects. Coming to the third level, which I think might be even the most interesting one, but that's just an individual opinion, the network level. Here you can ask questions about the entire network itself. And two measures that can give some representation of the network as such, or try to capture some characteristics of different networks, is the size and the density. Size is simply how many nodes are there in the network. Density is looking at how many of the existing links, so how many relationships between nodes that you observe are there in relation to potential existing links in the network. And quantifying these type of numbers is quite important. I give you an example with respect to density. Compare these two networks. When we look at these two networks, you would clearly say, at least I would say, the one with the more nodes is more dense because it appears to be denser than the other one from a visual perception. However, when you actually compute the number of realized and non-realized links and set them into relation to each other, you learn quite quickly that actually the network that visually appears to be quite dense is in a quantitative sense, actually less dense than the network on the other one. So sometimes visualizations, again, can be misleading. So it's really important to look at these quantification or these quantitative measures. Good. We use this, for instance, together with Holger Graf in a paper where we compared different networks over time and wanted to see whether policy can influence, let's say, knowledge networks at the regional level. So if you subsidize collaboration, let's say, at a certain moment in time, the question is, can you actually see this at the network level? Does the shape and form of the network changes? Relying on patent information and joint subsidized projects again here. Good. Coming to the last part, network dynamics. So far, we only described certain parts of the network, node level, link level, and network level. Now the question is, if we want to understand a little bit more how networks evolve over time. Basically, do they change their structures? What factors are potentially behind these changes or this evolution? And what type of actors are really important for a network to develop over time? Technically, a network can change over time because either nodes or links disappear or enter a network. Node entry and exits are rarely studied, interestingly. Usually we focus on whether links appear or disappear over time. So that's something to look out for. When we look at link formation and dissolution processes, they can again operate at these three levels: at the node level, at the link level, or structural network level. The node level, you can ask, for instance, okay, do firms, for instance, that are larger, that have more R&D, let's say, do they have higher capacities to establish more links than firms that are smaller, for instance? At the link level, there is a very famous concept, homophily, birds of a feather flock together. The question is, are actors that are more similar in one or the other dimension more likely to form or maintain network relations than other types of actors that are dissimilar? I think most of you will know the proximity concepts developed by Ron Boschma in 2005, or summarized by Ron Boschma back then. And these can essentially be tested in terms of their influence at the link level of network evolution. At the network level, you have some interesting processes like transitivity, clustering, where you can try to answer questions like friends of a friends become friends. You can look at trust and cohesion, whether that drives the network evolution over time. These are not link level or node level processes, but actually endogenous features of the network itself. Good. How you can do this in practice? You have a range of different methods. You have the so-called stochastic actor-oriented models, which are short form abbreviation as R-Sienna. You have separable temporal exponential random graph models, stair models, or gravity models, which are also known as spatial interaction models. All these different types of models have different characteristics. So for instance, the first two ones can look at or simultaneously consider factors at the node, link, and network level. Gravity models, for instance, they can't consider these type of network level effects like transitivity that I've talked very briefly about before. So the choice of these models depends very much what you're interested in and also what type of data you have available. Some of this data needs to be, or for some methods, you need data in longitudinal format. For some, you need just cross-sectional data. And if you want to know more about these comparisons of these methods, again, self-promotion, we wrote a paper a couple of years back that compares and gives some practical applications with respect to these different network models. Good. When it comes to software, I'll just highlight a few. Most importantly, there's R and Python that are available. I would recommend R, where you have packages like iGraphs, .NET, tidygraph, SNA, and so on and so forth. And that covers all of these aspects I've talked about and provides functions to calculate all of these different quantities and do dynamic network analysis as well. Well, how does it look like? For instance, and this is the last slide I'm going to present, you have some kind of an information about a network, let's say, as a simple Excel feature. That's a simple list, 2 columns, node A, node 1, and node 2, that are linked to each other if they appear in the same row. And then you need a couple of libraries, which you need to load in R, for instance. 2 lines of commands give you already a transformation of this Excel file into a network object in R. And you can, with 1 additional line, already get a plot that doesn't really look that nice. I get it, but at least gives you first visual representation of the type of network you're looking at. And then with 1 more line, essentially, you can already calculate the degree centralities at the node level to get an idea what is the node that is most embedded. In this case, it is node K10. That's all from me. That was a rundown of social network analysis. I think I've been a little bit over time, but well, it's a lot to cover.
Thank you so much for this presentation. I think that was very concise and still included a lot of information. And we already have a couple of questions for you, Tom. The first one you partly answered, but would you maybe like to add a bit more information? The question was, which software are used for network analysis? So you mentioned R and Python, but do you want to elaborate at all?
Well, you find also other types of softwares. Gephi, for instance, is also quite well established. It's quite powerful when it comes to large networks and specialized in visualizations of large networks. It's a kind of software where you can drag from menus, so you don't have to program yourself. But in the end, if you really want to do some kind of quantifications and run more sophisticated network analysis, which I assume most of you would like to do, then there's simply no way around R or Python. Whatever you like better, I would say overall, it's a little bit better implemented in R than in Python.
I'll continue with the next question. What is the largest challenge with dynamic network analysis?
I would say there are 2 large challenges. The first one is data, because to do dynamic network analysis, usually, but not necessarily, you need to have network data over time, longitudinal network data, unless you use these exponential random graph models that also work with cross-sectional data. But in the end, you really would like to explain the evolution of a network over time, and that requires that you have data on this. And this is harder than it sounds, because in most cases, if you, for instance, you can't really run a survey over time asking the same people over and over about their network relations, if we talk about relationships at the individual level. So you need to have some kind of secondary data sources. The second one is all of these methods, in particular the exponential random graph model and the R-Sienna model, let's say they're kind of tinkerish. So you have to play around with them quite a lot in order to find the model that is best suitable to answer the questions you're looking at. And the reason, very briefly, is because in a sense, these models try to simulate a network as closely resembling the one that you empirically observed. And then if you can infer from the simulation what type of processes have driven essentially this type of network you observe. And this is a lot of manual fitting and optimizing to really find a model that simulates a network really closely to the one you observe. It's fun, but you will spend a lot of hours, that's for sure.
Thank you so much. We have quite a couple more questions. So if you and the participants don't mind, we might run over by 5 minutes. And I will start with the questions that are more general before I move on to the very particular data and project related ones. So let's continue with, how do you study a small network compared to a bigger network to make it more deeply, to get a deeper analysis and get stronger results?
Yeah, I like that question. There's actually good news for, I would pronounce the name wrongly, sorry. No personal offense. So actually you have an advantage, because if you talk about networks, you look usually at the link level. And if you have a small networks of, let's say, 10 actors, that still translates into round about 90 links. If you have a directed network. If you have an undirected network, you have 45. So if you have even more actors a little bit, then you have over proportionally more links. So actually your unit of analysis is then this link level. And there you actually have then a much larger empirical or size of the underlying empirical data than just your nodes. So there's hope. I would say, in particular with small networks, if we talk something about, I would say 20 plus. I would say 20 plus nodes, that's kind of the minimum size of a network to do some more sophisticated social network analysis. But then you're really good. With 20 nodes networks, you can do basically all of what I've presented here, or at least hinted at in this presentation.
A bit more about data. Are there any secondary publicly available data sources that you recommend to play around with to do network analysis?
Yeah, there are. So I think if you look at our literature, there's a lot of network analysis using patent data. This patent data is publicly available. You can download it, for instance, from the OECD RECPAT regionalized patent data, which is already pre-processed. And there you can, for instance, look at co-inventor relationships, meaning two inventors that have collaborated on a single patent. Right, this is a kind of two-mode network. Nevertheless, you can construct these type of networks, which I referred to here. So that's a classical data source, which is great because it's over time. You can scale it to any, whether you want to have a very large network, you look at all the inventors, let's say in Great Britain, or you just look at those in the District of Kent or wherever. So you can scale this at any way you look at. Similarly, publications, academic publications, you can extract to a certain degree from Google Scholar, but also from other sources. Subsidized projects is something I worked with quite a lot, which is also publicly available in most cases. For instance, the European framework programs are right there for you, the data to be used with social network analysis. You can also build on a rich literature there. The rest is really context specific. There's some data sets on board co-directorships. So if two persons join the same board of a company, advisory board or whatever, that might be translated into network information. But honestly, once you start looking around and having this type of network perspective, you see this data everywhere. I see in the chat, there's also a question about text analysis. Of course, you can also study text from a network perspective if you look at individual words or tokens that co-appear in a sentence or are neighbors in text or appear in the same text, and so on and so forth. So once you start, there's so much data to go for.
Maybe because you mentioned this comment that includes text mining for a large database, because it's quite long, I might just ask you if you have any suggestions on quantifying network properties and dynamics in like a text mining and a text network context in Python or R or both.
So, Davide, this is a very good question. Let's put it like this. What I would recommend, really think about what is your research question to begin with. So yes, you can look at this large data set. It will take a ton of time to do anything more sophisticated than just counting the number of links between named entities or the co-occurrences of these named entities. You can do this. You might even be able to generate a kind of network and visualize everything. But then the question is, what do you really want to do with something like this? So you can't really employ, let's say, RCNA models or exponential random graph models, because they really don't work that well if you have more than 1,000 or 2,000 nodes, and you clearly talk about millions of nodes here. Then you will have to rely on these type of regression gravity models with which you can explain the link formation or links existence in your case, so whether two entities are linked to each other. Or you can look at how their frequency of co-occurrence changes over time. You can do this, but the question then is really, do you need to do this on this very large level? So isn't there maybe an argument for why you can say, hey, if I look, let's say, at this topic specifically, or I look at this time frame or region, you can actually simplify your task tremendously in the end and speed up the entire process. Both is possible, but I always say if you work with these really, really large data sets, is it really worthwhile in the end? Is it really necessary to answer a research question? Which I don't know. So there might be good reasons for it.
Thank you so much, Tom. And thank you so much to all the participants for the great questions. I think we went through quite a number of them and we did quite well. And unfortunately, we're not going to be able to go through the last couple of them due to time limitations. But thank you so much for this wonderful presentation and all your thoughts and help with the questions of our participants. Thank you so much for the organizers and the RSA. Before we say goodbye, I would like to draw your attention to the next professional development webinar, which is going to be in March, with collaboration with the Association of European Planning Schools Young Academics Network. So please sign up if you're interested. And if you want to watch back this seminar and hear more from Tom, and maybe if you didn't get everything and you want to go deeper, check out the webinar on the RSA Lounge and check out the RSA website, which also includes more information on membership. And this works by both considering career stage and geography. So thank you so much for attending. Thank you so much again, Tom and everyone. This has been a great session. Have a very nice day and goodbye, everyone.